Hello everyone, welcome to the next review. This is Borges' Labyrinths. Borges is a great writer who has composed only little essays or short narratives. Yet they suffice for us to call him great because of their wonderful intelligence, their wealth of invention, and their tight, almost mathematical style. Argentine by birth and temperament, but nurtured on universal literature, Borges has no spiritual homeland. He creates, outside time and space, imaginary and symbolic worlds. His sources are innumerable and unexpected. Borges has read everything, especially what nobody reads anymore. Borges was a literary spellbinder whose gripping tales of magic, mystery and murder are shot through with deep philosophical paradoxes. So admittedly, there's a bit of trepidation in starting to review this book. There are about 20 or so different short stories, because they are quite short of course, and there are also essays and parables. I'm choosing a handful of the stories to look into a little bit further. I'm not sure I'll cover the essays or parables. So beginning with the very first story, Tlön, Uqbar, Orbis Tertius. This is perhaps one of the most complicated stories I've ever read. Highly commendable in how much it's essentially a philosophical inquiry. It's less of a story and more of a series of arguments and conjectures about how a particular civilization might respond to a given philosophical a set of philosophical ideas, the main one being subjective idealism. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The story begins as an investigation by two writers into what they come to believe to be a country that exists no more, a place called Uqbar. They're trying to find other references and glimpses to it in almanacs, atlases, treaties and whatnot. They just can't seem to find any references to it. From there, the story really becomes, again, less of a narrative and more of, it's almost Borges speaking in his own voice, conjecturing about not only Uqbar, but for reasons I can't quite get into to avoid spoilers, a place called Tlön, which is another place that is of questionable origin. We learn that the inhabitants of this place called Tlön, they live under and through, rather, the perception of subjective idealism. For them, nothing exists that isn't in their imagination. Their language doesn't have nouns because they don't perceive objects to be independent of themselves. There are all these different interesting philosophical conundrums and allusions. There are, for example, the Ronir, which are objects that seem to come into spontaneous existence through chance and sometimes desire. There are heresies related to materialism. People can't even grasp the idea of materialism. I believe there are allusions to Achilles and the tortoise. There's so much here: mathematics, algebra, the very nature of reality. I can't quite talk about what, for me, is most interesting about this short story without giving spoilers, so I would skip ahead if you don't want the story to be spoiled. But so we essentially learn, after all is said and done, that the country of Uqbar and the world of Tlön that operates under subjective idealism is entirely invented. It was invented by society, but I believe it took about 300 years to fully construct. And for me, I found that fascinating because it very much feels like it speaks to mythopoeia, it speaks to world building. In fact, I imagined, I could see the legendarium in this grand project that in fact, as we learn at the very end of the story, we in the real world begin to believe that Tlön is real. It's such the project of Tlön, created by this society called Orbis Tertius, is so detailed that we begin to actually become fascinated by it as if it were real. And the very philosophy of subjective idealism then breaks through into our world, and the protagonist and everyone around him begins to see as the people of Tlön, the fictional people of Tlön, saw. So there's a lot in here, and it's a fantastic story. And of course, just to give you an idea of what this story sounds like very quickly, the 11th volume suggests that 3 prime reasons determine the complete victory of this idealist pantheism. The first, its repudiation of solipsism. The second, the possibility of preserving the psychological basis of the sciences. The third, the possibility of preserving the cult of the gods. Schopenhauer, the passionate and lucid Schopenhauer, formulates a very similar doctrine in the first volume of Pererga und Paralipomena. The geometry of Tlön comprises two somewhat different disciplines, the visual and the tactile. The latter corresponds to our own geometry and is subordinated to the first. The basis of visual geometry is the surface, not the point. This geometry disregards parallel lines and declares that man in his movement modifies the forms which surround him. The basis of its arithmetic is the notion of the circular ruins is the next story. This really highlights just how varied this collection is. There are realism stories, realist stories. There are also quite fantastical stories that have a completely different feel to them, an atmosphere. The story of the circular ruins concerns a priest-like figure who travels to a destroyed temple, destroyed by fire. And essentially his goal, we learn, is to construct within himself a man. He spends all of his time in this temple, sleeping, dreaming. It's a very aloof story. It feels more like a fable, very mythological in its construction. It feels like a mythical tale to me. It deals again with Borges' fascination with the nature of infinity, with idealism, with the power of the imagination. This story in particular deals with the concept of the tulpa, which is the creation of a person through the faculty of the mind. It relates to, for me at least, creation, the act of creation, how we put ourselves into our creations. Art informing art, I have here in my notes. The power of dreams, Azathoth, and his dreaming of the universe. Again, Dunsany, Clark Ashton Smith, The Jungle Book, the creative fire even. That twilight he dreamt of the statue. He dreamt of it as a living, tremulous thing. It was not an atrocious mongrel of tiger and horse, but both these vehement creatures at once, and also a bull, a rose, a tempest. This multiple god revealed to him that its earthly name was fire, that in the circular temple and in others of its kind, people had rendered it sacrifices and cult, and that it would magically give life to the sleeping phantom, in such a way that all creatures except fire itself and the dreamer would believe him to be a man of flesh and blood. The man was ordered by the divinity to instruct his creature in its rites, and sent him to the other broken temple, whose pyramid survived downstream, so that in this deserted edifice a voice might give glory to the god. In the dreamer's dream, the dreamed one awoke. The Library of Babel is the next story, one of my favourites in the collection. This was the one that I'd known about, the only one I'd known about before reading this collection. The Library of Babel concerns a universe which is composed entirely of a single library. In this library are many, many books, a seemingly infinite number of books, in which there are, in each book, on each shelf, just a collection of random strings of letters and numbers. In these books might be the answers to existence, the answers to everything. Of course, it's this philosophical conundrum that if every single word is represented, written out, every single thing that can ever be said or known will be in these volumes. It's quite like the infinite monkey paradox, the typewriters. What I love about this story is how Borges endows it with character. He makes this library almost a living, breathing place. A good example of this is one particular cult that believes in a figure called the Man of the Book, who they believe to be privy to the knowledge of the universe, who has found a particular volume that describes that is the key to the universe, essentially. What I found particularly stirring about this story is the idea that there might be the answers to all of existence, but the information is essentially useless. In fact, there's a great passage in here, which I'll read in a second, relating to how it drives men mad. People in droves commit suicide because there's simply, it's too tantalizing, this idea of in one particular volume there could be, again, the meaning of everything. It's essentially a pointless search because there are so many volumes and so many strings of random characters that mean absolutely nothing that it's like playing the lottery, except there's even less chance than obviously winning the lottery. Like all men of the library, I have travelled in my youth. I have wandered in search of a book, perhaps a catalogue of catalogues. Now that my eyes can hardly decipher what I write, I am preparing to die just a few leagues from the hexagon in which I was born. Once I am dead, there will be no lack of pious hands to throw me over the railing. My grave will be the fathomless air. My body will sink endlessly and decay and dissolve in the wind generated by the fall, which is infinite. Funes Memorius was an interesting one. I'm not sure I enjoyed it as much as the other ones that I'll cover, but this one is endowed with a little bit more character than the other stories. An issue that I have with Borges is that many of his stories, again, they feel more like philosophical treatises. They're quite aloof, quite distant, quite removed from any concerns of character and emotion. They don't really elicit any feeling in me other than, wow, that's an interesting concept. The story concerns a teenager who is kind of a savant. He, after an accident, finds himself incapable of forgetting things. He has a kind of a photographic memory. He sees everything as a series of distinct impressions. It's said that he can see the individual, he can make sense of the individual form of fire as we would see, for example, just a sphere on a desk, a very simple object. Everything for him is distinct. For this reason, he's incapable of generalizations. It's said he's incapable of Platonic ideas. I sort of take the story to mean that we only really have clear perception once we're close to death. Obviously, he was in an accident. The story also concerns this idea of the wasted miracle, but in order to explain that further, I would need to give major spoiler for the story. Suffice it to say, it's a fascinating story, a lot more personal, a lot more emotional. Highly recommend it. Speaking of the notion of the wasted miracle, the next story is called The Secret Miracle. It's one of my favourites in the collection. The story is about a playwright in Prague who is captured by the Nazis. He's Jewish, and he's sentenced to die by a firing squad. He asks God to give him time to complete his masterwork. In order to talk about this story a little bit further, I will need to give some spoilers, and I really do wish to read the end of this story, so skip ahead if you don't want spoilers, of course. A big drop of rain struck one of Vladik's temples and rolled slowly down his cheek. The sergeant shouted the final order. The physical universe came to a halt. The guns converged on Vladik, but the men who were to kill him stood motionless. The sergeant's arm eternized an unfinished gesture. On a paving stone of the courtyard, a bee cast an unchanging shadow. The wind had ceased as in a picture. Vladik attempted a cry, a word, a movement of the hand. He realized that he was paralyzed. The smoke from the cigarette he had thrown away had not dispersed. Another day went by before Vladik understood. He had asked God for a whole year to finish his work. His omnipotence had granted it. God had worked a secret miracle for him. German lead would kill him at the set hour, but in his mind a year would go by between the order and its execution. From perplexity he passed to stupor, from stupor to resignation, from resignation to sudden gratitude. Nothing hurried him. He omitted, he condensed, he amplified. In certain instances he came back to the original version. He came to feel an affection for the courtyard, the barracks. One of the faces before him modified his conception of Romerstadt's character. He concluded his drama. He had only the problem of a single phrase. He found it. The drop of water slid down his cheek. He opened his mouth in a maddened cry, moved his face, dropped under the quadruple blast. Jaromir Vladik died on 29th of March at 9:02 a.m. The fascinating story, the idea that God gives him more time to finish his grand work. He completes it simply for himself, but of course he is obliterated in this volley of gunfire, and no one knows that God has worked through this artist. House of Asterion. This is a retelling of the story of the Minotaur, the Labyrinth. So the next story I'm going to look at is the House of Asterion. I can't really talk about this work without giving spoilers, as it is rather short. The House of Asterion very much reminds me of, first of all, of Frankenstein, definitely. The Outsider by Lovecraft. Some elements of the Fall of the House of Usher by Poe, and also Piranesi as well. The House of Asterion is a retelling of the Minotaur myth. The Minotaur, of course, his proper name being Asterion, the starry one, in Greek mythology. It's essentially a twist narrative. We learn at the very end of the story that Asterion is the Minotaur. We come to see him as a kind of empathetic character. I know they accuse me of arrogance and perhaps of misanthropy and perhaps of madness. Such accusations, for which I shall extract punishment in due time, are derisory. It is true that I never leave my house, but it is also true that its doors, whose number is infinite, are open day and night to men and to animals as well. Anyone may enter. He will find here no female pomp nor gallant court formality, but he will find quiet and solitude, and he will also find a house like no other on the face of the earth. Even my detractors admit there is not one single piece of furniture in the house. Another ridiculous falsehood is that I, Astarion, am a prisoner. Shall I repeat that there are no locked doors? Shall I add that there are no locks? Besides, one afternoon I did step into the street. If I returned before night, I did so because of the fear that the faces of the common people inspired in me. Faces as discoloured and flat as the palm of one's hand. The sun had already set, but the helpless crying of a child and the rude supplications of the faithful told me I had been recognised. It's one of the shortest stories in the collection, but I found it was one of my favourites because it was more poignant, a little bit more personal. I also found I could connect with the character a little bit more as well. The last story I'll talk about is The God's Script. This story very much pertains to my interests in escapism and prisons and different ways of seeing. This story concerns an Aztec priest who is captured by the conquistadors and sentenced to imprisonment. His prison is a hemisphere which is divided into two halves, one for himself and another for a jaguar. The prisoner gives himself over to contemplations of infinity, the universe, the nature of language, things like this, very much Borgesian. But what I found particularly moving is that he begins to look towards the jaguar stalking around this other half of his cell, essentially, as the answer to his dilemma. He begins to look at the patterns on his fur and begins to think of it as the God's script. He tries to find meaning within it. He tries to connect the dots on its skin and whatnot, the lines. The fact that a prison confined me did not forbid my hope. Perhaps I had seen the script of Cuchulainn 1,000 times and needed only to fathom it. This reflection encouraged me, and then instilled in me a kind of vertigo. Throughout the earth there are ancient forms incorruptible and eternal. Any one of them could be the symbol I sought. A mountain could be the speech of the god, or a river, or the empire, or the configuration of the stars. But in the process of the centuries, the mountain is levelled, and the river will change its course. Empires experience mutation and havoc, and the configuration of the stars varies. There is change in the firmament. The mountain and the star are individuals, and individuals perish. I sought something more tenacious, more invulnerable. I thought of the generations of cereals, of grasses, of birds, of men. Perhaps the magic would be written on my face. Perhaps I myself was the end of my search. That anxiety was consuming me when I remembered the jaguar was one of the attributes of the god. I've only scratched the surface regarding Borges, but hopefully that gives you an idea of the variety, the density, the complexity of this work. Highly recommend it. There are stories, most of the realist stories, that I didn't really connect with, and sometimes I also felt like Borges might as well have just written an essay rather than a story, because most of his stories just feel more like inquiries into philosophical ideas and whatnot. So thanks for watching, everyone. Highly recommend the book. Till next time.